和丝绸之路研究，涵盖了佛教文献在密教和艺术中的角色、中世纪的经济发展、密教、敦煌的那个莫高窟的壁画以及建筑空间中的仪式美学等多个主题。目前正在进行的研究项目呢是11世纪于阗与敦煌关系的调查，以及萨珊王朝的神圣王权观念在于阗文化中的影响。好的，那我们有请史教授的精彩演讲。
女士们、先生们，大家好。所以今天我想要分享我的演讲。OK，因为我的中文特别差，特别糟糕，所以我用英文讲。而且如果你不太会英语的话，别怕，我把多半的我讲的放在PPT 里面，用中文放在 PPT 里面。So OK， 怎么这个怎么啊？可以。Okay, yeah. So today, what I would like to do is to give an introduction to this donor portrait. This is 这个供养人像，这是在莫高第98窟里面。And this donor portrait is very interesting. It's a donor portrait of the king of Khotan, Vishvasambhava. And what's interesting about this donor portrait is that it's very special. And there have been other scholars, many other scholars, mostly Chinese, who have researched this. So the question is, what can I add that's new? Now, what's interesting is that this donor portrait is the most complex and finely detailed of all donor portraits in the Mogao caves, and also Dunhuang caves. And also, it's very interesting to note that it was painted over, right? So when the cave was built, when Di Zhoushiba Ku, right, was built in the 920s, there was another donor portrait, but then this one was painted over. And now we have the king of Khotan. And so there's a kind of intentionality, right? Yitu Xing, right? There's a kind of intentionality that's really important to note. So here's an image of Mogao Cave 98. The king of Khotan is on the left, right? So 左边是那个于阗国王李尚天. And it's larger than life. Here he is by himself. And this is a painting by Zhang Daqian, right? And it's a painting that it's 这是一个复制的，当然, but it's an interesting painting because it has many of the details. So what's interesting is that there's an idea that this donor portrait of Li Shangtian is that of a Chinese emperor, right? So this is what's often argued. And this is what I want to argue against, which may seem strange, but in fact, there's a rationale to it. So this is a standard depiction of a Chinese Zhongyuan Huangdi, right? And then we have the portrait of Vishvasambhava, king of Khotan, there on the right. So a revised close analysis reveals that the portrait does not present the king of Khotan as a mere imitator of a Chinese emperor, but instead unveils the last surviving vestiges of a highly articulated court culture and a concept of kingship rooted in Persian culture and religion. Given that there's nothing, this is what I'm arguing, right? That there's nothing inherently Buddhist about the portrait, the information and models gained are crucial for revising our understanding not only of Khotanese kingship, but also notions of sovereignty in Central Asia, while providing invaluable information about non-Buddhist Khotan in general, most notably indigenous religious beliefs and practices. And so in this lecture, what I'll do is I've discovered 我发现一共有大概18个方向是跟一个中原皇帝没什么关系 right? And so that's quite a lot. And so there are 18 different aspects of this particular donor portrait that index Persian and Central Asian concepts of kingship and sovereignty, all of which are completely unrelated to the Chinese emperor and imperium. So today I'm going to choose 5 of these, right? What I call a dastar or piaodai, right? Belt, or what's known in Persian as kamar, a sword, pommel, and gesture. And before I discuss these, I want to preface it by some methodological considerations that allow us to go much further in depth into analysis. And I think because the audience for this talk is, there are a lot of younger scholars, I want to talk about methodological approaches, right? So 方法理论, right? Some methodologies which I think can benefit you in your scholarship. So what I've found is that there's actually, so this image belongs to a very complex set of what might be called a coherent court culture. Maybe the German would be Hofstil. And I'm interested in cognitive models, right? So 认知模式. I'm interested in these cognitive models. And so what I've discovered is that there are continuities from especially Achaemenid court to Sasanian court, and then to Khotan, Kucha, etc., etc. 等一下我会解释更深入的解释一下。So of course, what's important to understand is that the power of the Sasanian Empire, right? So it's a hugely important empire. It's only getting attention recently. And it's this empire that was able to package, right? So they have this ability to package, right? Brand, 品牌化, right? They kind of 品牌化 kingship, which is really interesting. And so I want to talk about that branding, if you will, and also the court culture. So here, just to be more specific, here are the various aspects. And here are the Chinese translations, so you can understand in case some of those terms are not familiar. And we're going to concentrate on the Sasanian, right? Sashan Wangchao. And of course, Yutian. But this court culture influenced in different ways many of these cultures, right? It was very, very powerful, very, very powerful. Now, the question is, how do we analyze that? How do we get at it? Oh, yeah, we can't forget the Suturan and Guisheng. So, again, looking at the extent of this Sasanian Empire, it's quite large. It reaches into the Chinese sphere of influence. And again, it's finally receiving attention that it deserves. And so on this this previous scholarship on Vishvasambhava, there are these Chinese scholars, almost exclusively Chinese scholars. Some I've neglected a couple Japanese scholars as well, but these are the scholars who have done very, very good research on this and have provided the basis for my research in many ways. So I appreciate that. But some of them, I think one of the problems is that they repeat some of the same sources again. And so I want to expand these sources, these primary sources. So people say, oh, well, Dr. Neal, right? There are all these scholars. What do you have to add, right? What can you bring to this? And I think it's possible if we use different types of methodologies and approaches, right? And also pay attention to detail. So I want to talk about methodology, okay? A few methodological considerations. And I'm very interested in cognitive biases, right? These cognitive biases, because they affect our thought. They determine our thought. And we are mostly not aware of them. And so I want to concentrate specifically. So we think we know what other people are thinking, right? And under this is this curse of knowledge, right? So we think we know. So we often think that other people don't like us. In fact, they probably don't care. But we think we know what other people are thinking. And then on top of that, we have something called the curse of knowledge. So let's look at the curse of knowledge, right? So the curse of knowledge is this cognitive bias that when we communicate with other people, when a person communicates with other people, they assume that others share their background knowledge, okay? And this is actually quite interesting, right? And the classic example is a professor who can't communicate to his students, right? Because he's forgotten what it's like to be a student. Sometimes it's called the curse of expertise. This cognitive bias also affects the way we do scholarship. So all of us as researchers and scholars have to be very careful because we impose our categories on other cultures and people without even knowing it. So the curse of knowledge, right, is an example, very concrete example is this, right? 这些永空, right? These remotes. And I have maybe 3 remotes in my living room. I don't know how to use any of them. And this might be an engineer or designer's ideal of a remote, right? Because they don't understand that maybe people don't want those choices. This is a user's ideal of remote, right? So it's important to understand this idea, the curse of knowledge, that you need to understand or try to put yourself in the shoes of other people, right? And in order to mitigate this curse of knowledge, I offer some suggestions, right? And one of them is historical empathy. And I don't know if that 历史共情或者是不是理同情理同情可以这样说或者感情right? So empathy, right? Yeah, 同理心, yeah. So this is really important. 同理心, right? Yeah, so this is important because we as scholars and humans, we need to be more empathetic in our understanding of other cultures. And I'll elaborate this in relationship to this portrait of Li Shangtian, right? We also need to do collaborative research, right? So we need to work across disciplines. So I'm personally interested in cognitive sciences, right? So I do archaeology, I do textual studies, art history, but I'm also very, very interested in cognitive science. And also we have to have what we call methodological reflexivity, right? And questioning our own assumptions. And that's one thing I'm doing now, right? So the curse of knowledge remains a significant cognitive bias in anthropology, history, and archaeology, affecting how researchers interpret other minds and cultures. Recognizing and mitigating this bias is essential to producing more accurate and empathetic scholarship. So now I mentioned the curse of knowledge because we're going to be talking about Li Shangtian or Vishvasambhava's clothing. And this is important because that, in my mind, has been misinterpreted by scholars. So there's something for all of you working that anything to do with fashion or clothing. We need to consider something called sumptuary laws. And these are laws that regulate consumption, right? And typically there are laws that have to do with limiting expenditures and restricting, but it's also, there are laws that determine hierarchy and status within societies. And in the Chinese context, it's really this yu fu zhi, right? So these, in dynastic histories, these were the laws and regulations that told us as, you know, for example, as Chinese citizens, what we can and cannot wear, okay? Well, we have become insensitive to this. We wear anything we want because we shop at H&M and Zara, right? And Uniqlo. And we have what might be called fast fashion, right? We can wear whatever we want, okay? This is not the way it was in traditional societies. You cannot wear anything, right? And fashion and clothing was very, very conservative, right? So no to fast fashion. We need to resensitize ourselves. We need to be empathetic about the time and place of people in the past and how they saw clothing and what clothing meant. And so there's this very interesting concept called deep wearing. And deep wearing really has to do with this idea that clothes are determinative of identity, right? clothes make identity. They give a depth to a person's identity. And clothes aren't just decorations. They constitute the individual. And again, the reason why I'm talking about this is because the clothing that Li Shangtian is wearing has been neglected in certain ways. And I'm going to go into depth in that. So deep wearing is that the person, again, is defined by clothing, that clothing makes the individual, and that clothing was in fact the identity. So if we look at donor portraits in Mogao caves, right? We look at Gongyang Renxiang in Mogao caves, the faces don't matter, right? All the faces kind of look the same. To us, that's strange, but of course, to people in the Tang Dynasty, the faces were not important. It was the clothing, right? And what's really interesting is that in Mogao caves, the only places that we have real looking faces, for the most part, are on sangre, on monks. For example, Hongbian, right? These monks in medieval China actually looked like real people, but donors, no, they don't, right? So this idea of portraiture and portraiture reflecting real identity through the face is something very late in Chinese culture, right? It comes very, very late. It's not in medieval period, right? The clothing is important. Now, this is important because if we look at the English expression investiture, it's a great word, right? And it means the act of clothing or dressing someone. Investire from Latin, and it means literally to put on clothes. But this word is great because we use it in English. Investiture means, for example, when Prince Charles became King Charles, he went through investiture, right? That was what we call the investiture. And literally what he's doing is he's putting on clothing, right? He's wearing clothing. And that, when he takes the crown, when he puts on the robe, the other clothing, that changes who he is, right? That transforms him, okay? Now, it's surprising, there's not a lot of research on Chinese, the investiture of Chinese emperors, right? At least not that I can find. But it's a very different metaphor, right? 受之意识, right? The metaphors, because I want to talk about metaphors, the metaphors are very different. But the putting on of clothing changes or transforms the individual, right? It actually transforms the person's essence and identity. And so we need to be sensitive to this. We need to be aware of this, that clothes really do make the man. Okay. And so what I'm getting at is that we really need to move to an emic perspective, okay? So in anthropology, there are two general approaches. These are a bit simplistic, but an Edic perspective is an outsider, right? So we're all outsiders to the Tang Dynasty, right? We're all outsiders to the Qing Dynasty. We're all outsiders in various ways, right? But as scholars, my ideal, right, 这是我的理想, is that we go to a more emic perspective, right? That we go to try to understand the subjective understandings and categories and qualities that make their world, that create their world, okay? And so I want to move in that direction. And again, this is just background. This is just background. So, oops. Here. Oh, yeah. Yeah. So, and the other thing is that thought is not language. Okay. So if we do a thought experiment, right? So if I say to you, okay, well, describe that person's face so that I can actually see it. You can't do it. It's not possible, right? Because language is not thought. Okay. What thought is a variety of mental representation systems, okay? Things like conceptual metaphor, conceptual blending, frames, mental models, cognitive maps, cognitive models, structuring narratives, and master narratives. And today I'll talk more about conceptual metaphor because it's important. And I'll be happy to come back and give talks on all these things because it's a big area. But I think this in some ways is this is a methodological approach which all can benefit from regardless of your discipline, because the human mind is pretty much the human mind around the world, right? It can do certain things, it can't do certain things. There are certain commonalities. There's a level of universality to it that we all share as humans. And it's these systems that allow us both, of course, to think and act and do, but also to share ideas across cultures. So human thought is not language. In fact, we use these systems. And we use these systems in conjunction with material culture, right? And there are scholars such as Andy Clark and David Chalmers, Extended Mind, Tim Ingold, Ian Hodder, Malaforis. All these people work with cognitive science, these mental representation systems and how they work, and material, and what we call material engagement. And so, again, this is just background knowledge. You don't need to know in depth, but I want to detail a little bit where I'm coming from in my interpretation of this particular donor portrait of Li Shengtian in Mogao Cave 98. So the clothing and adornment, particular in these religio-political spaces, whether donor portraits, images of kings on Kushan coins, or depictions of Sasanian gods in rock reliefs, are far more than decorative elements. Okay, this is really important. We understand this. It's not; these are extremely meaningful symbols, and we need to take them seriously. This is what I mean by epithetic scholarship. We need to take these symbols seriously and what they mean for the people of who create them. I say this in part because the first time I gave a talk on Li Shengtian, one of my colleagues said, "No, those things aren't important. You know, they have no meaning. They're not significant." And like, well, okay, good luck. You know, they're meaningful, and you can't be dismissive. And I'll come to explain that a little bit more in a second. So I'll skip this historical bit. Although note, this is very interesting in the in the Song history that Shazhou, right, Dunhuang, is located with India, right, Tianzhu, Yuqian, Gaochang, Weihu, right, Cengtian. You know, so Dunhuang in the 10th century was not a part of China, right? It was conceptualized as someplace very, very different, which must have been traumatic for its inhabitants, right? And this is very interesting. So it's isolated in certain ways, and what that means is that Dunhuang has to make alliances with the Uyghurs, right, the Western Uyghurs, and also Khotan. So it meant that in Mogao Caves, there was a tremendous change. Here, let's just get to the right. So Dunhuang is cut off, right, from Zhongyuan. There it is. And what happens is very interesting. All these large caves began to be built, right, from the late Tang. And what these large caves do is they reaffirm political power. Okay, so this is significant because it means that there's a change in mentality. And donors and donor portraits and these heqin, right, these marriage relationships become very, very important. And that's how it's possible to get these incredibly large donor portraits that we have in Cave 98. So, and this is these are these large so-called family caves that are demonstrative, that indicate the political changes and the need to use religion and the Mogao caves as spaces to assert political legitimacy. So let's get talking about Li Shengtian. Okay, so typically he's identified as a Chinese emperor, and Tan Chanshui, that's the image on the far bar left there, says, okay, well, these are all the features that we have on Li Shangtian's clothing. And therefore, he is a Chinese emperor, right? This is the logic. So they present this visual evidence and also this textual evidence, right? So there, right, in yellow, 上天衣冠如中国, right? And this is always pointed to as used as evidence that, oh, well, he just wants to be a Chinese emperor. Okay. This is one account. We don't have many. So this raises the question of textual sources and the reliability of textual sources and our reliance on textual sources. I think in some ways it's more useful. I mean, of course, textual sources are important, but they need to be combined with material culture. And the material culture needs to be taken very, very seriously because, as I said, we don't think in words, right? Language is not thought. You can do much more with images. For all of those in art history and archaeology, they're very, very complex systems that, of course, text can complement, but they need to be taken seriously on their own. So this is this book by Wen Xin. It's very, very good. He's a great scholar. He's at Princeton. And this is, I've translated probably badly, these two passages, right? The sovereign at his Gaozhuhui destination, the Khotanese king Li Shangtian, also claimed to be an emperor in the Chinese documents produced by Khotan. Gao's observation that Li Shangtian's clothes and hats were like those of the central country, Zhongyan, right? Zhongguo, right, is directly borne out by Dunhuang materials, right? So then he says, okay, well, we have that passage. Then we have this Gongyang Ren Xiang, this image. And he says, well, look, we have that text and we have this image that looks like a Chinese emperor. Therefore, he's a Chinese emperor. And then below he says, right, for 10th century viewers of the cave, what was depicted in this image was unambiguously, right? 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 Unambiguously a Chinese emperor. Okay, I would advise scholars not to use the word unambiguously. But what he's doing is he's saying anybody goes in that case thinks automatically that's a Chinese emperor. And I'm going to argue against that. I think that's completely incorrect. That people during that time would have noticed these symbols and differences. Okay, so let's, yeah. But he also says, okay, well, there's this Khotanese expression, "King of Kings of China." Okay, in his book, I don't think he mentions that there's also this geography where Vishvasambhava, the kings of Khotan, also call themselves the lords of Turks and Tibetans, right? So if they call themselves the lords of Turks, does that mean they want to be Tibetans and they want to be Turks? Probably not, right? Probably not. So there's this convention of what's called simultaneous kingship, which Wen knows about, and also King of Kings epithet, which is just common use of titles, right? This is a common use of titles. So this idea that, okay, he's wearing Chinese clothes, maybe he was wearing them for 10 minutes and he couldn't wait to take them off as soon as the emissary left. We don't know, that's just one account. Imagine if a foreigner who didn't know anything about China came to China. He said, God, they're all wearing Western clothes. They're just like us. Well, yes and no, right? So we have to be careful of textual sources. So I'm going to skip by. There are 4 other portraits of a king of Khotan in Mogao caves. I'm sorry, 4 altogether. Yeah, 3 others here. And let me just get to the court style. We'll skip this. So what is at the core of my argument is that the elements on Li Shangtian's clothing represent this idea of Huarna, or divine glory. And we have all these terms, right? So this is this idea that comes from Persia, from the Persian, greater Persian context. And it's a concept that means divine glory. The primary meanings are this luminosity, the shine, the splendor. It's often associated with fire. So we get metaphors of fire, images of fire. images of fire coming off shoulders, for example. And it also means, therefore, peace, happiness, abundance, and fortune. Okay, so it's a really core idea that is at this core, at the center of kingship in the greater Persian context. And it's what informs so much of the image of Li Shangtian, right, that I'm going to talk about. So it's really this idea of this mystical power that is a kind of sacred glory. The model is that the king was divinely chosen, right? So if my analysis and hypotheses about the image of Li Shangtian are correct, and there are symbols of this divine glory on him, it means that these index or reference a different conceptual system, right? It indexes a different set of religious ideas. That means it also references a different set of narratives, also references a different set of ritual practices, okay? And the center of this, the most symbolic, right? 所以有代表性的 is the so-called dastar, or these piaodai, okay? So this is these diadems that likely come from Greece. And it was probably, there's debate about whether it comes from Greece and gets taken up in Persia via Alexander, or Alexander really emphasized it when he was in Persia and developed it when in terms of Hellenic cultures. And so here, this dastar is associated with this ribbon, this diadem. And what's important about this word dastar is that it has to do with hand, right? So hand is at the root. And so we're going to look at metaphors, conceptual metaphors of handing, gifting, and you'll see how these work out in terms of the symbolic elements that I show you, okay? And so let's just, in terms of conceptual metaphor here is this idea that we go from something we understand to something we don't understand, right? So in Chinese, you have all these expressions that use hand, right? 掌握, right? Or 把握, right? 掌权, right? All these expressions, these are metaphors, right? We can't actually hold power. We can hold an object that maybe symbolizes power, but we can't. Knowledge is abstract, right? Opportunity is abstract. Power is abstract. Evidence is abstract, right? But in order to make these abstractions concrete, we can use the metaphor of holding something in one's hand, right? To hold power, right? So these are common. We use, you can see seize opportunity, right? These work in English too, in some ways, right? We use the same underlying conceptual metaphors for these. So let's see how these work. So the ultimate symbol is this crown and this ribbon diadem. And this diadem is used in Greece by victors. Of course, this is the what I told you before. But this becomes the ultimate symbol of power, of divine power. It becomes the ultimate symbol of Huara. And we find it in Persia, and I'll argue that we see it in Li Shangtian. Okay. So here, if we look at these rock reliefs, we have places where these very famous reliefs in Iran feature this gifting of power, this gift of power to the gods. Here, you can see in the middle is, I think I should, oops, sorry, yeah. Here we see the king receiving from Mithra, there on the right, the ring of power, right? He's grabbing it, he's taking it with his hand. So again, this idea of taking power or holding power. On the left is Anahita, who's also gifting him these piaodai, or these dastar, with the diadem. And so this is the type of investiture, right? So he's being acknowledged as legitimate by the gods. And it's interesting, he's bigger than the gods, right? But he's wearing the same kind of clothing, and this is important. So notice the clothing. So in these rock reliefs, we have these investiture scenes. Here's another one, for example, where Mithra is granting ardashir. the ring of power with the dastar, with the piaodai. And that's, oh, sorry, Ahura Mazda. And on the left there is Mithra. Here's another image, just a little clearer. So that's one way. Gifting, you can get this quara, this divine glory, this divine power from the gods as investiture. You can also get it through victory over your enemies, right? So here you see this is in Bishapur, a victory in war. You can also gain them. You can see Apam Napat, this deity, bringing one of these diadems to the king, right? So he's one power. He's getting even more divine glory. Another place you can find it is in hunting, right? So by hunting, you can show how strong you are, how victorious you are, and this way gain divine glory from the gods. So it's really amazing because so much of Sasanian art is grounded or founded or focusing on these particular scenes of kings showing their legitimacy through gaining divine glory. So this kind of Sasanian silverware. Here's another image. You can see Apamnapat here gifting the king for his victory over the animals in a hunt, right? So again, so much of the scenes are these hunt scenes. Now you know why, because they depict the power of the kings vis-a-vis the legitimacy granted by the gods. So what about Li Shangtian, Vishvasambhava? Finally, right? So here he is, and it's really interesting because if we look very closely, he also has these piaodai. Right? He's also wearing these piaodai. They're very specific. They're very detailed here. Of course, we find these on lots of deities, right? We find them on bodhisattvas, Pusa, right? Maitreya typically has them. But it's interesting here because this is a portrait from the 5 dynasties, right? This is 10th century. But here the king is clearly wearing these piaodai. And we also have textual records that he was wearing. But what's also interesting is we look very carefully, we see them on his sword, hanging off his sword here. We also see one hanging from his belt. Okay, and scholars have not analyzed these. I don't know, and somebody can correct me, but I don't know any scholar who's gone into depth about the explanation of why these are here and what they're doing. But they make sense if we understand them as a vestige or connected to Sasanian ideas of quara gained through, for example, military victory or hunt, right? So behind each of these, there must be a story. There's probably a story behind each of these piaodai hanging here. We don't have the stories, but no doubt there is. So let's look at the belt. Let's look at the belt. This belt is very interesting because if we want to say that, oh, his belt is just like a Chinese emperor's, it's not. Chinese emperors have very, very particular belts, right? Right, these excuse me, so-called dadai or gadai, right? And they're very, very particular. Again, if we go back to the sumptuary laws, these excuse me, there are only certain belts emperors can wear. Chinese emperors wear. They can't wear any belt. And so even if we look at, for example, this picture of Renzong, he's wearing one of these very standard, typical belts prescribed by law in Chinese dynastic histories, for example, in other texts. Here's a close-up. Now, if we look at these scenes here, right? We saw this scene, Taki Bustan, and we look very, very closely at the belt, this is Ahura Mazda, right? So this is a god, and this is his belt. And we look at Li Shangtian's belt, it's precisely the same, right? If we just take this and make it longer, it's precisely the same, right? It has nothing to do with the Chinese emperor, right? And I think anybody who is familiar with imperial iconography in the Chinese context would think this is a little strange, right? This is not a normal Chinese emperor's belt, right? It's signifying something completely different. It's pointing to a different conceptual system or a different cognitive model of kingship and what it means. And if we look at other images of emperors, and there are quite a few, because in the Weibo Jiejing, Jingdian or Bianxiang, right, we have lots of Chinese emperors. They never have a belt like Li Shengtian. Excuse me. You can see here, this is in Weibo Jiejing, 那个金变 in 莫高第98窟. Completely different, nothing like Li Shengtian. Okay, so that's the belt. Now, what about what we call the sword pommel? Okay, so that's the grip. So the sword pommel is very, very different from what we find on this typical sword that would be used in or by a Chinese emperor in ceremonial context. This is where we see it on the emperor. Okay. Now, if we look at this is this sword. This is a Sasanian sword, very similar. It doesn't have the guard that the Li Shengtian sword has, but it's very, very different in shape and form from the a sword used by a Chinese emperor. And here, what we see. Oh yeah. So here you can see the the sword pommel guard. In English, we call this a sword guard or hand guard, rather. Here is very close to what we have here also. Also, these, what we call mount, or the way the sword is hung, is very, very similar to a Sasanian sword. It's very particular. I think perhaps the most interesting thing is this fist, right? So what we call the pommel. So what is it? It's actually a hand. Susan, can I get some tea? Yes. So this fist is particularly interesting. It's a fist holding. It's a fist actually holding that piao dai, right? And this is, other scholars have interpreted this as being a shouyin or shouzi, right? A Buddhist mudra, Hushan Rulai, right? For example. But that's actually different. That's with the thumb inside, right? So it's a different it's a different mudra altogether. So this Tan Chan Shui interprets this as a Buddhist mudra, as a protective mudra, right? Shouyin, but it's not. Right. So this is how you make that particular shouyin. But if you notice on Li Shengtian's sword, his thumb is outside. His thumb is outside. So that's not what it represents. It makes sense, though, if we understand it as holding this dastar, holding this piao dai. And what's interesting is that we actually find this on maces and spears. Here it is here, right? You can see very clearly, I've adjusted the color a little bit, right? But, it's this metaphor of holding power, right? This is what it symbolizes. It symbolizes that the gods have gifted him this piao dai, this dastar, and that he possesses it. And what's really fascinating is that we actually find this on Sasanian silverware and in Sasanian elements. If you look closely, here you can see the fist, right? Fist at the end of the spear, right? So this is, again, this is something that indicates the legitimacy and the authority of the king or a person who possesses it, right? This is one example. This is an image from Panjiken. I'm sorry for the quality is not very clear, but you can see at the end of the sword, there's also a fist. I'll try to get a better image of that. Right? So this goes back to this idea of court style, right? There's a court style that is expressing these core ideas of huara, of a divine power and divine glory that's gifted by the gods to the aristocracy, to the kings. Here you go. So another example is this from the Ashmolean, this mace or scepter from the Ashmolean. And one of the symbols of Ahuara are actually rams. So at one end, we have these rams' heads. Okay, this is at one end. So Ahuara can be represented by different animals, in this case, gongya, right? But here we see actually there's a fist with a hole through it, right? So we could actually we could take a ribbon or string and tie it through there. Excuse me. So again, clear indications that this was an actual object, right? Li Shangtian's sword was an actual true object that represented divine power. We can get other instantiations of this where ribbons are tied in the same position, right? So we actually have the piao dai tied to the sword or to the mace. Here. Here's another example. We have them on coins, for example. These are quite early, right? So it shows that even in the Kushan and Parthian context, this idea of a piao dai, dastar, was a symbol that was widely recognized and takes different manifestations. In our case, right, we're talking about a 10th century donor image, right? An image from the 10th century that still maintains this tradition. This is why I love Dunhuang in the Mogao caves, because there's so much material there that allows us to go back and look at materials elsewhere and make sense of them, right? So what about this hand and ball motif, right? So this is quite interesting. We also have this, this hand and ball motif here, where we have clearly what is meant to be an animal, totem here, finial here, representing Huara or power, this ram's head, for example. This is probably Anahita here. And then the hand holding an object. So what is that object? Is it related to a piao dai, right? Is it related to Li Shangtian's sword? I think it is. Nobody's explained these coherently, but I think if we look at this, this large model that I'm talking about, it's possible. So here we see this mace with this ball, right? So at one end, it can be a hand holding an object which looks like a ball. On this side, we have a ram's head also with a ball. What is that? Here's a, I would argue that it's Huara as a pearl, right? And I would argue also that the Moni Baoju comes from this tradition, right? So I'm giving a very different interpretation to the Chintamani, right? Chintamani or Moni Baoju, but I think it actually is influenced by Persia. And we can see here, let's see here and here. Here's a larger image of it here. And I'll tell you why. So how could the Moni Baoju be related to Huara, and what's the connection? Well, there's what we'd call a master narrative or a structuring narrative behind it. Again, if we use these sort of cognitive references, here it is. What's going on there? Well, there's sorry, this is a bit much text, but there's a story of Ima, right? And this is a structuring narrative, right? This is a narrative that structures legend and myth that structures information, and this information is crucial because it has to do with Huara, this divine glory. So this story of Ima, this primordial king, basically he is somebody who reigns successfully. He's a very successful king. He's granted this Huara, he's granted this divine power, but then he grows prideful. And he starts to claim too much power. And so one of the interesting things about Huara divine power is that it can leave you, right? It's conditional. It's conditional. And so he eventually loses his power. And what the Huara leaves him, and it flees, it leaves him, and it goes into the water. And so this is, and we remember, Huara has to do with flames, fire. So we get this fire and water motif. right? This is fire and water motif. And I would argue this is where the Chintamani in certain representations come from, right? So the mythic flame water, the motif of hidden splendor as depicted as a flaming pearl, right? Embodies the elusive and transcendent essence of Huara. And so this is also where, these, what is it, 双龙习珠怎么那个对对就是 yeah that I would argue that also comes from this, right? That only appears in the Tang Dynasty. And so here, this idea of a flaming pearl, we see quite readily, right? So what is he holding? He's holding a flaming pearl. Earlier images of Chintamani, for example, from Yungang, even Longmen, Chintamani don't look like this. They look like cut jewels. They look like an emerald, for example. They're very, very different. So this motif of a pearl, I'm sure, comes from this story of Ima, ultimately, having to do with Huara. So, yes, here we go. And so, again, it's very interesting. I think, there we go. Yeah. So this idea of a flaming pearl in water, right? Those are two fish swimming around it. Later, the one on the right is from the Liao dynasty. We get these makura, these fish-like creatures. But there's this conception of a pearl in water of the Chintamani that likely goes back again to Persia. But it only makes sense if we understand it as Huara, right? So let's move from, let's still continue talking about hands and the metaphor of hands. Here we see a dastar wrapped around the wrist of a hand. This is quite interesting, right? Symbolizing the possession of Huara. But what I want to do now is turn to the gesture. So if we look at the gesture the hand is making, because nobody has talked about this gesture found in 那个供养人像, right? 第98窟的. So let's talk about this gesture. The king is making a very particular gesture, right? This is not the gesture that is associated with a Chinese emperor, okay? In fact, this gesture is directly connected to Sasanian royalty, and it's a gesture that comes out of Persia, crosses Central Asia, and becomes widely used in Central Asia, also in Xinjiang. We see it here. And what's distinctive is the way the thumb and the index finger are held together, and the pinky, the little finger, is extended, right? It's extended. This is not a Buddhist mudra, right? 不是一个佛教的手印, right? We look at the pinky, right? Well, what's remarkable is that we find it on other aristocrats here. And I'm sorry, the images are not terribly clear, but here at Kizil Gaha, all of these aristocrats are making the exact same gesture. And it's only aristocrats, right? It's only the royal family that makes this gesture. So it's a gesture that is indicates rank and status. Here we also find it. You see, it's very particular, right? This bent little finger, right? So the thumb and index finger together, and then the pinky extended or made to distinguish itself from the other fingers. But what's really fascinating here, Kuala, in Lorestan, which is on the far west of Iran, we have a stucco relief of Anahita. If we look very closely, her finger is also making this gesture. So what does this tell us? This tells us that aristocracy, right? Royalty and gods, right? It's making a connection between royalty and gods. So only royalty and gods can make this particular gesture, right? In iconography. We have other examples here. Other examples, these small seals, where the offering of a flower, right? These are not Buddhists. They have nothing to do with Buddha, zero to do with Buddhism, right? This is a so-called Zoroastrian god, if you will, Anahita, who is making this gesture. We see it here, right? You notice here all on this place. And again, nothing to do, zero to do with Buddhism, nothing to do with Buddhism. She's a goddess. So again, it's gods and royalty. That implies that royalty is divine, right? There's a kind of sacrality about royalty. Here also, we have many examples of this. Here you also see the little finger extended. Nope, there you go. Here also, but also kings, right? So this is likely from Armenia. Sorry, Georgia. And we see also this king with the exact same gesture, the extended pinky, this extended little finger, right? So the importance of hands, right? Go back to the conceptual metaphor of hands indicative of holding, possessing, obtaining, but also reflecting divine power. Also in these rock reliefs here, we also see the same gesture of holding the flower. Oh, sorry, holding the flower, offering the flower with the thumb and forefinger together and the extended pinky. Here we have it at Taki Bostan, right? If we look very closely, we find the exact same gesture, right? So what does it imply? It implies that humans, these particular humans, are linked to deities, right? These particular humans making the same gestures as deities. And that's one of the interesting features about images of the kings of Khotan is that they also share the same clothing. So if we look at the clothing of the kings, they resemble those of the gods. And we can see this with Vaishravana, for example. But here, and I'll finish up quickly because I think we're probably running out of time. So here we have these Nike or Putti Eros type figures. Just to go back just to make sure, these are on either side of the what's called Evan here, right? Offering the reeds, right? Offering the dastar, offering the piao dai, showing divine glory, but also at the same time, right? You see the piao dai there, the dastar, but also with the finger, a gesture of royalty and a gesture of gods. There. So here's another one, also the same here. Quite dramatic, so a brilliant blend of Greek and Roman, but also Persian imagery, but also setting the type of stage in some ways, as I mentioned before, this particular packaging of kingship that packages these concepts such as Hwara, divine glory and power, how it's manifested, but also the use of hands, right? The use of the hand as primary in the indication of divine power, but also divine status and legitimacy. Here gifted in the right hand and indicated also in the left hand with the finger extended there. So this is my conclusion. Sorry, a lot of words, but these are just 5 very, very small parts, right? So in this image, this particular image, there are about 15 other very, very significant items, which I have not discussed, which also index or point to Hwara, right? This divine glory, that have nothing to do with Buddhism, has nothing to do with Chinese notions of Chinese kingship or Chinese emperors. But they've gone completely unstudied by scholars, I think in part because of these biases, right? Saying, oh, it looks like a Chinese emperor to me. Okay, that's not good enough, right? That's just a little too simplistic, and it belies our ability to be empathetic in some ways. So, as I say, there are about 15 other elements that point to Persian and so-called Zoroastrian notions of kingship and sovereignty. These, far from random and merely decorative or worse, nonsensical, right? Saying, oh, they don't mean anything. These elements are tightly structured in a web of signification using shared core concepts, cognitive models, conceptual metaphors, and blending and master narratives, right? And I haven't talked about again, these are background structures that when I'm doing my research are there in the back that I use to single out and analyze various phenomena. I'm happy to talk about those more at another time. But it's precisely through these shared cognitive mechanisms and their material manifestation in visual and material cultures that cultural transmission is possible, right? Because we all share these abilities, we share certain metaphors. Singling out one or two of these signifying elements without acknowledging the larger systems and meanings does an injustice to those who created these works and falls short of a more desired emic reading of this and other materials at Dunhuang and elsewhere, right? So you can't just pull out one of these elements and point to it, right? It's an entire system. Because again, there's this 意图性, right? This intentionality to this portrait that we have to consider. Otherwise, it's not going to make sense. We need to take, just to continue reading the last paragraph, we need to take a more empathetic approach where we listen to these as yet unheard voices by approaching these materials not just as historical data, but as expressions of lived belief, identities, and spiritual aspirations. We gain a fuller understanding of their significance, both learning from and honoring, right? We can learn from this, right? And honoring the humanity behind these creations and preserving the nuances that might otherwise be lost through detached analysis or worse yet, dismissed as insignificant. 谢谢大家。
非常感谢史汉文教授的精彩演讲那接下来我们有请这个杨子龙老师对这一次活动的总结。
各位老师、各位同学，大家下午好。非常高兴，也非常荣幸有机会能够听史汉文老师的这场非常精彩的报告。那因为我自己本身也不是做艺术史研究所以这场报告当中学习到非常多的内容。那下面我会对这个做一个简单的评议。那相信很多如果没有接触过艺术史的同学，对于刚刚开始接触莫高窟第98窟的这样的于阗国王供养人像的研究的话，可能会有些陌生。所以在评议的第一部分，我会大致上对于敦煌莫高窟第98窟的一些情况做一个简单的铺陈介绍。相信有了这些背景知识，包括以往研究的这个介绍，大家会更能够理解史汉文老师这场讲座当中他的一些内容。这是曹逸金的第98窟在整个敦煌莫高窟当中外观上整体的一个位置，大家会发现它处在标注的第98窟的那个位置上。那整个洞窟的情况呢都可以如这边所述这是主室内部壁画位置的一个图它有顶上有这个团龙藻井，然后四方有天王，然后上有七佛，然后这个中间画着这些各个的经殿，然后底下有相应的供养人，然后它的位置大概是在这个，然后这边画的是这个右边画的是叠压式的一个供养人像但是如果大家看这个第一个箭头所指的位置，那边第一个就是于阗国王，它处在整个壁画的这个南边，然后又靠近东边这一块所以是在这个右边那张图第一个这个红方框的底下所以这是它好像不太灵敏，大概在这个位置你走，大概在这个位置。然后这边它的这个壁画构造呢，这边有这个僧官与幕僚所以它是在这个南边的前边这一块更多是绘制的这个长辈然后这边这个北边的这一块呢也是幕僚更多晚辈，然后还有这边的是女性，这边是这个 相应的这个男性，这是他大概的一个位置。然后这边就是我们所说的这个于田国王的这个像的位置。然后这一张就是具体的这个图了，然后这个是这个于田国王还有他的这个夫人曹氏夫人啊，然后这是右边这张图是可以整体上的观看，刚刚石汉文老师的讲座当中也给我们呈现了它一个整体的状况。那对应排列下来的人物的情况啊，大概就是于田国王、李胜天啊、曹氏夫人背后一些僧侣啊等等等等。那这是一个整体的情况。那以往对于这个莫高窟第98窟的这个研究上啊，有一些基础情况啊。首先是最开始是窟主是有一些争议的啊，有人认为是李胜天，但后来啊，基本上有了共识啊，这是曹一金，窟主是曹一金。那第二个呢，对于这个洞窟的营建的时间啊，也有一些争议。然后啊，有人如果认为窟主是李胜天的，最开始是认为是后晋天福年间，那后来啊定义到这个窟主是曹一金，然后有一个更为宽的一个上限不早于后梁乾化4年，啊建成之后的后唐同光3年。那最新的一些研究呢，啊就进一步的推定，大概是在924年落成。但是对于它的始建时间啊，也有一些争议啊，有说是914年的，有说是918年的。那一般情况下，好像914年的得到更多的认可啊，而曹一金在位的时间就是914年到935年，所以基本上他在位刚上位的时候就开始了这个洞窟的营建工作。而以往对于第98窟的图像的研究呢，啊，基本上很全面啊，就藻井还有千佛四天王最开始的那张图呢，我们其实也大致上看到了千佛四天王大概的位置，还有对于它的经变化有食谱啊非常多，还有供养人的画像有292身，这是邵强军老师的一个统计啊，当然也有觉得更少一点的，但目前这个他统计下来的数过去的292身，所以量非常大。那其中这个也尤其是这个李胜天的这个供养人像的话，也暗示了曹金跟当时于田的这个关系啊，他把女儿嫁给了李胜天，所以有这个皇后曹氏啊，也就是在李胜天右边的一个位置，我们刚刚看到的图。那李胜天在整个于田国的这个王系当中又处在一个什么位置呢？啊，这是斯洛文尼亚的这个于田国史当中的一个排序，这个于田国的这个王系。标红色的位置差不多就李胜天所在的这个位置啊，所以这是对于他的一个基础情况有一些相关的了解。那对于这个于田国王本身这一个项的研究，以往也非常非常多。刚刚史汉文老师其实也展示了好些，他列举了非常多的人名，大家如果去看的话，会发现做于田史研究或者说做敦煌艺术的非常多著名的老师都在上头。它的大概的形状就是它的人像特别高大，远较于其他的供养人像要更高啊。它的一个基本情况，然后尤其有一个大朝大宝于田国大圣大明天子啊，即是窟主这样的在左侧有这样的一个仿题。然后对于它的研究，基本上涵盖了它的相应的方面，就冕冠、衣裳啊，衣裳又包括上衣、臂膝，还有系就鞋子，还包括配件跟配饰。所以基本上涵盖这些方面。这一些方面的研究呢，虽然有，但基本上啊，正如这个石汉文老师今天所说的啊，可以做一个统一的概括。这个概括呢，就通常认为以往的这些相应的这个服饰上的特征，包括像配件这些东西啊，都具有中国风格，因为他们更多的是受到啊，比如说像中国画或者说自身的一些这个背景知识的影响。所以更多的是将其与中国风格的进行比对，所以啊，统一归纳出它跟中国的某些的相似成分。那如果有一些不同样的成分呢，基本上有一个归纳，就这是于田国本身的一个特色啊。然后另外说这个国王是佛教国王，那为什么是佛教国王呢？可能是受到2个这个影响。第一个呢，就于田国的确是这个佛教影响非常佛教文化非常兴盛。那第二个呢，就刚刚所谓的这个莲花印，就是这个剑柄上的那个手啊，这个拳握的这个手莲花印，然后认为是密教当中的莲花印，所以把它作为一个于田作为一个佛教王国的一个代表。 但是呢，通过石汉文老师的这个研究其实非常非常丰富从方法论的到具体每一个部分每个部分分析了哪些呢？飘带、腰带、剑。那飘带、腰带与剑这三个都其实是有一个飘带在上头飘带是在王冠上的这个飘带就冕冠上的飘带，腰带是系在腰间有个飘带，然后还包括剑柄的地方也垂下了有一个这个腰带。然后还有相应的这个手势，通过这一系列组合的探讨，发现它都是有一个这个源于伊朗带有萨珊风格这样的特色，并且都突出了这个神圣荣耀的一个王权核心理念的一系列的这个组合，他们共同由这些服饰来相关的符号共同构建了一个非常紧密的图像跟事物的一个网络，而这个网络来凸显的恰恰就是萨珊风格跟神圣荣耀这样的一些特色所以石汉文老师的研究相较于以往的研究可以说是一个颠覆性的，是推进了一个极大一步所以这是石汉文老师在这个研究当中的一个很大的贡献。那如果我们来细看整个的一个相应的研究的话，那可以讲到的地方也非常多比如说从最开始提到的这个细读细节加新的研究方法，因为我之前拿到的只是一个非常简版的一个介绍，所以今天听完这个讲座内容非常丰富，刚刚很紧急的打了一些这个内容细读细节跟新的研究方法细读细节毋庸置疑了，基本上将一个图像拆分成各个的模块，对于每一个模块细致的比对它跟以往的一些图像当中的相似成分，所以我们会发现石汉文老师在整场讲座当中他呈现的图像资料是非常多的，非常非常多，所以这是细节上的把握。那新的研究方法呢，就所谓的一个新的这个数据跟认知模型认知科学如何来服务于我们对于这个文化交融当中的某些物象的一些认识。那尤其提到这个认知偏见，那以往的学者其实不仅是那个时候的学者，包括古人的一些技术也是如此，说李胜天这个于天国王形同中国，所以很自然的人们就会通过自身的一个文化背景来看待它跟中国的这个传统的帝王的这个肖像当中有哪些相似的成分，来进行相应的比附说这是可能这个于田国的一些特色，然后又糅合了这个中原文化的一些特色，来共同形成了李胜天的这样一个这个形象。但是这很可能因为我们自身的文化背景如此有一些相应的前见，导致我们可能会忽略掉它某些东西。所以要来对抗这样的一个前见与偏见的话，需要更多的来历史共情，来协作研究，来进行方法论的反思。这是在方法论上一个我觉得很重要的层面。那第二个很重要的层面就是它对于服饰的整个理解跟定位，我觉得也特别重要。那以往我们会认为服饰可能仅仅只是一个服饰本身而已，但是在史汉文老师的理解来看，它是自我是身份的一个很重要的表现，自我身份恰恰是借由着这些服装还有相应的饰品来展现它自身，所以借由着服饰以及服饰周边各个细物所构成的一个整体，那么它暗含着某些概念，也是认知模型结构性叙事跟权力系统的一个这个强大而神圣的这些指示符，交织着非常复杂的文本跟仪式实践。所以对于服饰本身的定位讨论，以及将各个饰品组合成为一个系统展开进行研究，这是在于图像研究具体进入到一些这个人物上的一些研究，我觉得是一个非常重要的这个理念。那另外还有这个视角上的一个这个分析，比如说处在外位视角还是这个内位视角，是更客观的来照看，还是进入到这个主观的把握，在史汉文老师的讲座当中都有很多的这个讨论。那还有包括这个以往这个我们更多的是囿于这个中原文化系统，所以我们关注的通常都是后边一个部分，就敦煌跟中原相应的关系。所以出现在敦煌地区莫高窟的这个图像，它怎么样与中原文化发生相应的联系？ 但事实上，敦煌所处的位置又特别的特殊。它事实上从这个西边到伊朗、中亚到中原，它事实上有很强的整个文化发展的一个脉络。所以石汉文老师的这个关注，他敏锐地发现了就伊朗、中亚到敦煌之间的这个文化上的某些联系，借由着于阗国王供养人像这样的一个因素，它当中的服饰组合成的整个这个一个系统，来揭示了伊朗中亚文化到敦煌发展的这样的一个过程。而这个过程事实上也反映了这个宗教跟王权当中的某些关系。而事实上我也会联想到好些内容。那战如老师最近出版了一个新书，叫《新全球主义与佛教：诸方所流归一位》这本书。在这本书当中的第2篇，就历史篇当中，它恰恰就是勾勒了由这个印度、中亚，然后再进入到中国，再到这个像日韩地区的一个发展脉络。所以如果我们在进行某些图像研究，尤其是处在一个节点，比如说像敦煌这样的位置的时候，可能需要更大的放大我们的视野，来看待整个的一个流变的脉络，而不仅仅只是囿于一处的一个单个比对。所以这是一个非常重要的我联想到的一点。那另外呢，因为我自己并不是处理这个艺术史研究，所以对我而言，来照看艺术史的话，会难免的带上这个文献上的一些特色。在文献上处理，大家也经常会发现很多文献有它相似的这个段落，那我自己通常会称为这是一个模块。那有的是单个模块出现，有的是作为一个模块组出现。然后今天来听史汉文老师这个讲座，我发现在艺术史研究当中也是如此。当你面对的一个图像，你可能难以下手事实上你可以切分出若干的模块，而若干的模块它跟其他的一些艺术形式当中的某些部分又会有呈现很大的相似性。所以来把握这些模块以及模块组的相似性，能够为我们进行讨论更大的问题，然后提供很重要的一个思路。所以这是我能够想到的在我们日常研究过程当中的一些进路。那事实上我也有想到一些相关的问题。那这是以往研究对于这个冕冠的一个讨论，所以会发现通常都描绘头后部左侧有一个心形的红簪背后有个红丝绦组披于背部但是这个其实我在听讲座的过程当中已经解决了第一个问题这个原来的比较简单的这个文稿当中，这个问题我可能还会有疑问，就是以往对于这个飘带有2种解释一个是说这个按照《洛阳奇兰记》或者《素云行记》当中的记载的于阗国王头着金冠4机制，头后垂2尺深绢广5寸以为饰，然后说这个可能就是带子就是这个。那如果按照第一种解释，它事实上是没有说明为什么会有这样的事，只是说这是个于阗国的特色而已。但是很多研究我们需要更进一步的来思考，那为什么于阗国会有这样的特色呢？于是有人就以往的研究提出了另外的一个这个想法，就宋史于服志当中也有一个说，这个叫做平天冠。平天冠它背后金饰玉簪倒，红丝绦组带，然后他觉得这个飘带可能是这个平天冠。那如果粗看的话，的确也相像，所以以往的研究很可能就是停于此了，就成为一个共识了。但是如果看今天的这个研究的话，如果从一个严密的这个符号网络系统的话，我们会发现它的这个飘带，它不仅仅只是出现在一处，在头冠上而已，它还有包括腰间的腰带，还包括它剑柄的这个穗。所以如果整体系统上的考虑的话，所以我会认为这个宋史于服志当中的这个相似处可能并不成为一个很重要的这个，或者说一个比较正确的结论。我还是会更倾向于史汉文老师今天所提供的这个答案它可能来自于这个伊朗的萨珊王朝的某些这个印记，所以是一个圣王之相的一个表现所以这是我是最开始的问题一，还包括今天听完整个讲座之后，我个人认为如果来回答问题一，可能可以这样来回答也不清楚这个史汉文老师会不会同意我这样的解释。然后这是其一。那以往对于这个行商医治然后也是我们会很容易发现，这个以往描述这个左腰间还配有莲花权柄长剑，这就是以往的定论。 这是一个莲花全印，然后它来自密教的因素啊，这个于田国这个敦煌地区密教特别的盛行啊，于是很自然得出这就是一个定论。但是呢，从今天的这个研究来看啊，也是有很大的一些推进啊。那如果刨开这些推进的话，在其他的一个问题上，那我可能还会有这个几点想向老师这个请教。就第一个呢，就其他服饰，比如说这个像这个我们讨论了冕冠，讨论了某一些配饰它与中原这个的一些特征不太相符合，是否他们也会有来自于这个中亚或伊朗的来源这样的一个解释呢？就比如说，以往也特别会关注到一个现象，就是在李胜天供养像当中，他佩戴耳环，他的双手的小指佩戴着指环，这个在中原的这个传统文化当中是没有办法找到与此相应的。那以往的研究呢，也是觉得这就是一个可能是于田国的一个特色吧，也没有做进一步的讨论。那如果按照老师今天的这个研究的话，会不会觉得这样的一个可能也会有来自于中亚或伊朗的这样的一些来源能够进行解释，而不仅仅只是止于说这就是于田国的特色这样的一个简单的答案而已呢？这是一个问题。那第二个问题就是于田王的这个供养人图像在敦煌莫高窟当中，还包括敦煌的这个图像当中它不止一个，它有比如说像这个莫高窟第98窟，还有第4窟、第454窟，还有榆林窟的第31窟。当然454窟是这个尉迟疏罗不一样的人，那其他3个窟都被认为画的是李胜天所以画的是同一个人。那么他们是不是也跟这边的莫高窟第98窟一样，具备着刚刚老师分析的这么一个系统的网络，来呈现这个萨珊王朝的某些这个特征，来凸显这样的神圣王权呢？那如果没有，而有一些变化的话，那么这样的一个变化是否会代表着它进入到这个敦煌地区有某些这个图像上的一些流变特征或发展规律呢？然后这是一个问题。那还有一个问题就是我们现在，因为尤其是在剑柄上这个尾巴上这个飘带的话，很容易让我们想到现在的一些刀与剑比如说剑穗儿，还包括刀柄上的一些丝带，它们的来源也是有这个萨珊风格的这个达斯塔尔或者达斯塔尔的这种的神圣荣耀的有关吗？还是说它是一个另外的一个这个来源系统，而有了我们现在看到的刀剑上的一些剑穗或者红丝带之类的一些特征？这是我的一些这个疑问一并向老师请教。那我的评议大概到此结束，谢谢老师。
我作为对非常好，所以我不知道回答这些问题都需要so how should we 我们还是不是
没问题，时间应该可以。对，您可以先回答这个杨老师的
老师来回答，
或者是现场可以先回答后面的。
对。
Yeah, so 我可以用英文回答吗？
可以。
Okay.
是就翻译
Well, so it's interesting in your slide number 11, right? Kind of true, right? So this is really fascinating, right? Because here we also have evidence that the emperor in the Song Dynasty had a jade fist, and that jade fist also had a string tied to it, right? And he also held a stick, and this stick is very much like we saw in. Is it possible for me to show? Yeah, maybe this is but this stick is also so the fist is a jade fist from Khotan, and it says that the emperor never leaves the palace without this jade fist from Khotan with a string tied to it. Right? So if he has that, but he also has this these ribbons, right? These red ribbons. It's likely influenced from Khotan. 是雨天的印象。Yeah. So I think that's very, very interesting. But it means that the emperor in the Central Plain was receiving influence from Khotan, which is quite interesting because I think, or maybe not influence from Central Asia, let's say that, which is quite interesting because nobody discusses this, right? So it means that this model or this system of this kind of Pinghua, right, of Sasanian royalty and aura was very, very powerful. Right? It's a very, very powerful model that was even appealing to the Chinese. And it shows the complexity and different flows of influence, right, back and forth. The other questions I think I need time to reply to. 我需要一段时间，因为所以不需要考虑一下。但是特别精彩，特别谢谢你杨先生，真的非常好，非常我感谢你的反馈。
是
对，所以我不知道我听着。
看一下线上，因为有100多人关注，已经没有成为可能对I just ask very simple questions. Regarding the elements, decorative elements you discussed about. I was wondering whether this can be the influence from the Indian Buddhist iconography.
Which
Because as you mentioned, they have the the dasta. That, right? Certainly also have such kind of decorative elements, right? Especially in Orissa, we have a lot of Padma and Bajra Bunny who has the same thing. So I was wondering, would that be possible? Some art science, saw the model from there, and then
it's possible.
And actually also, by the way, the cult of Bodhisattva worship is really prevalent across China, even in the Dunhuang region, right? And we all know that the kingship always deeply associated with the Bodhisattva worship, and especially in Southeast Asian countries, right? So is that possible? Such kind of cult somehow influence the portrait of the king, because sometimes the king is deemed as the manifestation of the Bodhisattva, right? Like the female emperor considered as the manifestation of the Maitri. So that's really maybe they have such kind of element. But I really very much fascinated by your ideas regarding the symbolic meaning, the significances from the finding the Central Asia context. And I was wondering, because that is in a Buddhist case, right? So like for Buddhist artists,
so let's step back, and so let's remember that these kings, right? So the king in Persia, right? In Kushans, among the Kushans, right? Even earlier, these are all multi-religious societies, right? And so the king, it's unlikely that the king would be only a Buddhist, right? Or the king would only be a Zoroastrian, right? They're kings of very complex, multi-religious, exactly. And so they will do all things, right? But the image, because I'm only talking about 5 of these aspects here, right? There's nothing Buddhist about that image. He is in a Buddhist context, right? Obviously, he's making offerings to the Buddha, right? In this context, but there's nothing in that image that is specifically Buddhist, right? There's nothing that says that he is a Chakravarti, right? We can find that elsewhere, where we have texts that reference him, or even the so-called king of Khotan, king of Dunhuang, right, as a Chakravarti. But there's nothing in that image. But it doesn't have to be. That's okay, right? It's okay. But it's just, from my argument, again, there's this kind of intentionality, right? Right?
Yeah.
About that, which is really, somebody took a lot of effort, right? To make this painting. They spent a lot of time and a lot of effort. And my sense is that it's probably for the Khotanese community at Dunhuang, right? Because they're the people who really understand, right, the symbols and the importance of the symbols. And so he really wants to show his legitimacy. But it's just that legitimacy and that authority is tied to this concept of wara, right? And so all the other symbols, elements also point to this divine glory. So.
I think I have seen such kind of gestures in India.
Really? Okay. Yeah, sure. Yeah.
In Amaravati, I have seen such kind of
interesting. That's late, right?
Amaravati, 2nd century.
2nd century, that early. Okay, interesting. Okay, interesting.
Maybe we can.
Yeah. We'll have a project.
Great. Thank you so much.
Yeah, thank you for your comments. Thanks.
那你还有一个同学。
Yeah.
Still regarding to the better receive the news, because when I see the reasons, at first I noticed how they depict this reason. It's very different from what they are, for example, would be saying in Muslim, because we can see the reasons, they are very likely.
Yeah, exactly.
The bigger. This is actually, we can say this is the opposite. This is the smaller. So my question is that is this a kind of is it possible that it can be a coincidence? So the reasons if you dress like luxuriously, it is very it's a common way that you attach lots of decorations to your clothes. For example, like ribbons.
Yeah.
So is there any evidence that they depict this kind of ribbons in this way?
Yes, sure. Yeah. I think so. That's a great comment, and I think the ones that Takipo's done, for example, are idealized, right? Also on the rock reliefs in Iran. There are these flying things. They show this sort of magical power.
Yes.
And I think this is actually realistic, right? Here. Yeah. And I think just also because we also have the ones here, and this is a great printing. Thank you for the poster, right? But also you can see here they're pretty much the same, And if it was just one, maybe in the back, but now we have these two others that really reinforce, right? The images. Yeah.
But really, regards to the titles, we can say that how they depict the titles is very similar to what they do.
Yeah.
But when they depict the ribbons, it can be very different.
Sure.
Sure.
I think for sure there's local variation. Right? Yeah, for sure. But there is, just the fact that we have, for example, the fist and the ribbon or the maces with there's a consistency, right? There's a coherence there. But for sure, there's local variation, right? And this may be like the Khotanese, the Khotanese look, Khotanese style. Yeah.
So actually, I have a question.
Okay.
And my question is, how should we coherently interpret these Chinese elements that actually occupy the center of our vision? And for example, the stream or the ribbon placed actually behind his head, right? It's not as prominent as those massive Chinese throng.
Right.
Is this kind of, a process of changing of the costume and the Sasanian or the Persian elements no longer holds the primary position.
Yeah.
And then how can we then in the context of Dunhuang, are these Sasanian symbols truly effective for the general audience?
Yeah.
And who is the Italian audience?
Right.
Yeah.
Exactly. Yeah, perfect. I'll start with the second part, right? So I think that's a great question, and I think people now have misread, right?
Mm-hmm.
Right? People haven't even noticed them, right?
Mm-hmm.
Maybe at this time, I think like I said, I think they were probably for the Khotanese community more than anything. But they also may have had some numinous, right? Ling, like ling or ling, numinous power, right? So when we put the image there with these particular elements, that it takes on a kind of magical power, right? That could be a part of it also. So it's not even for an audience, but it's for the king himself. It's for the image himself. Right? But I think the question of audience is interesting because we misread it, right? We haven't understood it. And I think, but again, I think we know that there was a large Khotanese community in Dunlop, and we know that there are aristocrats, right? Wait, right? You can wait in Dunlop. So I'm sure, and the fact again that it was, it had to be repainted. That this is a new image of. We don't know who was there before. It might have been a bad version, right? It might have been a really bad painting. It wasn't good enough. He said, redo this. And I went, this. We don't know. But the question of audience is very, very interesting. As for the, clearly this is, I don't mean to say this is only Persian influence, right? Clearly there are Chinese elements, right? And how they mix, is an interesting question. And what they meant to the people, the Khotanese, is also a very interesting question. In my analysis here, I want to open it up. Right? I want to open up interpretation to say, there are some very, very interesting non-Chinese elements, right, and non-Buddhist elements that we need to pay attention to, because all the sources from Khotan that we have, almost all the sources are Buddhist and Chinese, right? We have Tibetan sources, but they're Buddhist sources. So they all have this particular angle, this particular bias. And so that's why this portrait is so valuable, right? Because it gives us indication of other possibilities.
Thank you.
Yeah.
好的，行，那就我们线上差不多，差不多就150人左右。
Okay.